Good evening. My name is Claire Bishop, and as Executive Director at American Public Square at Jewell, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our first program of the year this evening. Tonight, APS presents Signature Series event, Disrupting American Politics. During this moderated panel discussion, we will explore the structure of American electoral processes today and weigh the potential benefit of improvements or innovations on our current model. A sincere thank you to our panelists and moderator for being a part of tonight's program, and thanks as well to all of you who are joining us live tonight. Additionally, I would like to thank our program and presenting sponsors, including the following: the Wiley Foundation, the Sherman Family Foundation, Arnold Ventures, Ogletree Deacons, Sue Seidler-Nerman, the Irv Hockaday Family Fund, and the William T. Kemper Foundation. As with all American Public Square programming, we welcome requested fact checks and questions for our esteemed panel. Please use the Q&A feature of Zoom to submit your fact check or question. Our fact checker tonight is Chris LeBeau, Librarian Emerita from UMKC. APS is excited to roll out our new digital fact sheet tonight, which can be used by our audience to add context and background to this evening's conversation. Find a link to the digital fact sheet in the chat window now. Finally, a quick shout out and thank you to all APS members, and a reminder that APS is a membership organization. So if you're not a member, but you like to support high quality, fact-based, free community programming while hanging out with people who share your interest in this, you might consider joining tonight. To sweeten the offer, we're running a special promotion this evening. If you sign up either during the program or afterward before midnight tonight, we will provide not only your membership with an annual gift, but an additional membership for you to give to someone that you care about. So please keep that in mind as you enjoy tonight's event, and more information can be found at www.americanpublicsquare.org/membership. With that, I will turn it over to American Public Square CEO and founder, Ambassador Alan Katz, who will be moderating tonight's discussion. Alan?
Thank you very much, Claire. It's a pleasure to be here. And particularly, I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. At a time of all the partisan discord that we read about every day, we've decided to have a discussion about election reform and what is needed to restore confidence in our elections. And so let me introduce tonight's panel. We're going to help us work our way through this particular topic. First of all, we have Benjamin Ginsberg. Mr. Ginsberg is a nationally known political law advocate representing participants in the political process. He is most well known for his work representing the Republican Party and its political campaigns, candidates, members of Congress, state legislatures, and governors, as well as corporations, trade associations, businesses, and individuals participating in the political process. He represented 4 of the last 6 Republican presidential nominees. Next, we have Dr. Greg Vanami. Greg is an associate professor and department chair in the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. His research and teaching focuses on American government, state politics and policy, civic engagement, voting and elections, and statistical analysis. He's published in the Journal of Politics, Political Behavior, Public Choices, American Politics Research, and Election Law Journal. Finally, we have Benjamin Singer. Mr. Singer is the CEO of Show Me Integrity. He's worked with Republicans, Democratic, and independent reformers since 2012 on local, state, and federal advocacy campaigns to create a more effective, ethical government. He's worked on ethics, campaign finance, redistricting, and electoral reforms with leaders across the political spectrum, including Senator John Danforth, Rob Schaaf, and an independent effort to help reelect the late Congressman Walter B. Jones Jr. His work has been featured in TV, radio, and newspaper outlets throughout the nation. So what I'd like to do in setting the stage for this conversation, and then the first question I'm going to throw is going to be to Ben Ginsberg, so he can be ready. I think if we look at what's happened with the perspective from both parties involving the efficacy of our elections, the Republican narrative is that there is fraudulent activity that has taken place over the years, and there indeed are a basis for that in the origins. If you look to the big city machines that used to operate with impunity in a number of places across the country. As far as the Democratic narrative is concerned, it's voter suppression. And that, again, also has antecedents in the South in particular, where we require the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in order to implement the 15th Amendment. But nonetheless, what happened is that, but we now look at two other points, which are there is very little evidence currently of election fraud that's been verified anywhere. And we've had the highest turnout in the history of our country in the last presidential election. So Ben Ginsberg, start by telling us whether A, I've characterized this split correctly, and if not, correct me.
Alan, thank you, first of all, for having me, and it's great to be here with my fellow panelists discussing this very important subject. I think you have stated it correctly, that in fact, the fraud versus suppression debate has morphed, unfortunately, into a place where it's become part of both the turnout mechanism and the fundraising mechanism for the particular parties. And I think you are right to say that there is scant evidence of fraud. And despite the charges of suppression and some, I think, bad legislation Republicans have passed in the state, nonetheless, the fact is we had the highest turnout in our history in the last presidential election. What's also interesting to note about that high turnout figure is that Democrats go by the notion that in a high turnout election, they're going to succeed. And Republicans seem to believe that in a high turnout election, they'll fail. And the other thing that the 2020 election tells you is that Republicans may have lost the White House in the very high turnout election of 2020, but they were wildly successful down ballot. They won more U.S. Senate seats than anticipated. They certainly won more U.S. House seats, despite a really well-funded effort by the Democrats on the state legislative level. Republicans picked up roughly 150 state legislative seats and hung on to every legislative chamber. So the myth of high turnout, I think and the political imperatives it brings sort of got exploded in 2020, but neither party, because fraud and suppression is so much part of turnout and fundraising, is going to take a hard look at that, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. And Greg Vanami, so you're the political scientist on the panel. Why don't you explain to our participants, our viewers, and your fellow panelists, one, do you agree with what Ben just said in terms of how he laid it out? And what else has your research shown you that A, is important or not important, regardless of what either parties think are important?
Well, first, thanks for having me on the panel. I'm glad to be here and to talk about these questions. I agree with Alan's initial summary and Ben's statement of where things stand. If you look at the academic research on this, and there's considerable research on both the fraud and access debate, there's not a whole lot of fraud that exists. We should have a lot of confidence that contemporary American elections, and if we look historically, we're going to get a different story. But if you look at elections over recent decades, we have very clean elections. Laws and policies around voter integrity are also aimed at only a slice of voter fraud, which is voter impersonation, which is among the very few occurrences of voter fraud that we have, among the rarest. On the other hand, if you look at issues of voter access, your standard basket of election reforms around relaxed registration, mail-in ballots, in-person voting, absentee voting, those are things that polling place locations, those are things that can marginally move the electorate, but not by much. We're not seeing a whole lot of movement to increase turnout, up very much or down very much. So it's something where, from an academic standpoint, the debate over fraud versus access tends to be much ado about nothing. Now, it's an idea among partisans that just won't die. I mean, no matter how much evidence there is that this stuff really doesn't matter, Democrats are convinced that these things will help them. Republicans are also convinced they'll help Democrats and hurt them. So insofar as any of this affects turnout, one of the other things that we know about any increase we see in turnout tends to be among marginal voters, people who maybe they're going to be there, maybe they're not. What we also know about marginal voters is demographically, they look like Democrats. And that drives a lot of the politics too. So if you look at those marginal voters, they tend to be younger, they tend to be less educated, they tend to have lower incomes. Democrats look at that population and say, they're Democrats, we want them to show up. The problem is they're also pretty alienated from the electoral process. They don't have strong political preferences, and when they show up, they tend to vote randomly. So they tend to about equally split between Republicans and Democrats. So even when we see a change in the electorate or the composition of the electorate, we don't see much of a partisan impact.
Okay, so Benjamin Singer, let me ask you this question, which again, in 2020, we obviously had a unique election to the extent that we were in the middle of a pandemic, and therefore a bunch of adjustments needed to be made. As someone who's looked at this whole question of, election reform, were the changes that were made, the accommodations that were made, I believe, for example, Georgia finally had drop boxes. I don't think they'd had drop boxes before 2020. The Pennsylvania law in terms of when the ballot could be counted when it came in. Is your sense of things that was a problem? Or was it just sort of so specific to the situation that it's almost irrelevant?
Question, Alan, and thanks for having me. Just as a background, Show Me Integrity is a cross-partisan organization. So our board includes Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So we're bringing a relatively balanced perspective, we believe, to these questions. Obviously, the perceived integrity of our elections is just as important as the actual integrity of our elections, because this is about legitimacy. It's about consent of the governed. It's about a social contract that is supposed to bind us all together as Americans. So for the special accommodations made during the pandemic, it's important to have our leaders not undermine those in some of the ways that Ben and Greg have alluded to with these false partisan narratives. I think, they know at least as well as I do the academic research that I think Greg was alluding to from, for example, the National Bureau of Economic Research about strict ID laws not helping or hurting when it comes to suppression or photo ID. These are hot button political footballs used to campaign. But, I think we'll talk later about some of the things that can stop the divisive rhetoric and maybe focus us more on solutions. But when it comes to vote by mail, the ability to vote by mail and absentee voting, we all know it's been around since around the Civil War. And traditionally, it helps a lot of rural voters and older voters who you would think would actually probably skew more Republican. And indeed, vote by mail doesn't seem to have any perceptible partisan effect. In fact, there was a California congressional seat that was flipped blue to red. It was the first time a congressional seat had flipped blue to red in all vote by mail elections. So the perceptions and some of the allegations that those kind of things help Democrats just are not borne out by the evidence and have been used by Republicans successfully for a long time, including in Florida. So, I think the biggest problem isn't the changes themselves, but again, some of the rhetoric, the false rhetoric from partisans on both sides about these changes. We implemented a program with support from both Republican former Governor Matt Blunt and Democratic former Secretary of State Jason Kander to allow Missourians to request their absentee ballots much more easily during the pandemic than they were previously able to by creating a website, movote.org, where anyone could do that. And it was some people who joined the event with, very prominent former Republican and Democrat who previously had campaigned against each other said, why can't more of Missouri politics be like this? So I think it's on those of us who are practitioners and reformers in the field to try to forge those bipartisan alliances and create a new climate around these voting laws in the country instead of the divisiveness.
So thank you, Ben Ginsberg. What about the changes that took place in 2020? Do you think that they were reasonable? Do you think that there was funny business? What's your take on it?
Well, a little bit of each. Really depends what we're talking about and where it took place. I mean, I kind of agree with what everyone's saying is that a lot of these are kind of issues that are marginal in terms of results, but which the partisans get really revved up about. I think part of what is behind the question you're answering or you're asking is what's gone on legislatively since the 2020 election to try and further gain an advantage. And I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that Republicans have tried in a lot of states to sort of tilt the playing field their way with various voting bills. But it's important in looking at that to remember a couple of things. The first is there's a difference between whether you've got 29, 27, or 25 early voting days for voters. And that is not a moment of great constitutional crisis, I think, nor is it Jim Crow, to be honest, while we're talking about heated rhetoric in a polarized country. But some of the state laws where you can move the casting, counting, and certification of ballots from election professionals to partisans has real potential, deep, long-term implications for the validity of the vote. And secondly, I'd sort of make the point that while Republicans can come in for criticism of what they've done on the state level, both for the content, but I think it's a political mistake in much of what they've done. But the Democrats in Washington, with their erstwhile election reform bills, trying to tilt the playing field in their direction as well, in addition to having some substantive provisions in their bills. So this is sort of a season where the political animal is behaving badly on both sides.
Okay, so Greg, jump in for a second and sort of think, if I said to you, okay, what should they be able to agree on that would kind of, make things, because essentially, I think the underpinnings of all this is we need people in America to agree that the election results are fair. They don't have to like the outcome, but they have to believe the process is fair. What do you think people might be able to agree on, given the hyperpartisanship the country that we live in right now?
I'll answer your question. I just wanted to take a quick second about the previous question, the framing around whether the changes to 2020 were a problem. We got 145 people on this call. Like, if you could all just send a card to your local election official, 2020 was a miracle that it didn't go way worse than it did. To roll out mail-in voting on that scale, on that short of a timeline, was just astonishing. There were some problems with it. There were some hiccups. It is astonishing that the wheels didn't come off as quickly and as adaptively as they had to move for that. Usually they would plan this for years, not months. Now, in terms of things that Republicans and Democrats might be able to agree on, I think there's some space. Whether this is, it's probably not going to happen at the federal level. The federal government doesn't regulate elections that much. But if you wanted to do something at the state level, there may be space in there for Republicans and Democrats. So if Democrats would give on voter ID laws, that's a pretty typical Republican ask. Maybe some things on ballot tracing. A number of states have done that, ballot tracing, for mail-in ballots and a curative process. So if you submit a mail-in or absentee ballot, you can track everywhere throughout the process where your ballot is and then correct any problems. If Democrats would give on those, they may be able to get a little bit on voter registration deadlines or more days of in-person early voting. So there may be space in there for compromise.
Okay, so Ben Singer, your group is a bipartisan group. Why can't you guys just get this done in Missouri? After all, you got Jack Danforth, and you've got Jason Kander. You've got two outstanding leaders of their party. Why is it so difficult?
Great question. As we've already established, right, a lot of these things are more for political purposes than actually well-meaning. But of course, compromise is also difficult, even if a legislator did want to compromise. If a Democrat were to support photo ID, they would probably get primaried from the left. And if a Republican were to support something that looked like it was, some Republican could run to the right and say it's going to promote voter fraud. They could get primaried from the right. And so I think later we'll probably talk about some of the ways we can solve that problem. Of course, what we would love for our elected officials to do is put public service first and focus on trusting the voters and creating a real legitimate electoral process. But we've reached the point with, I think one of the attendees here, asked a question about gerrymandering. In these gerrymandered districts, it's tough to bring people together when you have to just focus on the primary and you're a safe Democrat or a safe Republican. What we can do in Missouri is, and we're really lucky and blessed to have this in our state, is we have a ballot initiative process where we can go around the legislators and we can get common sense things done that bring people together. It's just extremely difficult. And of course, now the Missouri legislature is trying to make it even more difficult to pass initiatives because they don't like that we've gone around them and passed some of these things. But it's certainly something we can do. It just takes a lot of time and effort and volunteer power and fundraising to get it done.
And again, I promise you, we will get to that issue with that. I know you're just chomping at the bit to get to in a moment. I want to go back to Ben Ginsburg for a second here. Ben, you talked about some of the things that have been passed in legislatures that sort of literally sort of move things out of the hands of the election officials into the hands of the state legislature, for example, and other things. I want to go back to what you think, whether you think these things are a product of, among other things, the elimination essentially of pre-clearance in the Voting Rights Act. And if you would explain to our viewers, since you've litigated this issue, I'm sure, what pre-clearance was and is, and what the effect is of not having it in place right now.
Well, the broad answer to your question is the things that we're talking about with election officials and those changes, I think, would not come under the Voting Rights Act. The number of early voting days and polling places would. So you got to keep those issues separate. But the Voting Rights Act included a provision for certain jurisdictions that had a history of racial discrimination, where any changes in elections, which could range from dates to locations to a whole broad range of issues, had to be pre-cleared by a division of the Department of Justice up in Washington, or a 3-judge court in Washington. And that portion of the Voting Rights Act was struck down in 2013 in a decision called Shelby County, basically on the grounds that the coverage provisions for those jurisdictions was outdated, that the Voting Rights Act was in 1964, that the country had made great progress in terms of stopping bad acts with voting. In fact, there was an African-American president of the United States at that time. So that the coverage jurisdiction was improper. And so actually it was the coverage jurisdiction as opposed to Section 5 that got tossed out. But the effect was there was no more pre-clearance. And the states that were covered were largely states in the South. And with that was a supposition, to the extent there is racial prejudice in the country, it is isolated in those states and couldn't possibly exist in the North, in the Northeast or the West, which was part of the court's rationale in tossing that out. So as a result, this is the first, or this is really the 2020 was the first presidential cycle where those covered jurisdictions didn't have to run their changes past the Justice Department.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to go to our roving reporter now. Tricia, you are out there. I can see you've got a few questions, but what's the first question we have from our viewers?
Thank you, Alan. We do have some great questions and encourage everybody who is listening and watching to add your questions to the Q&A. Larry and Ken both shared a sentiment. Neither party represents me. Some people may have this feeling, but third parties have never succeeded in the US. With our polarized political climate today, do you think a third party is even possible?
Ben Ginsberg, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, that's easy. No.
Okay. Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, mostly no. It's the political science story on this is the number of parties is largely governed by our electoral rules. And in the US, we have single member districts. That means in every election, we elect one person. That creates an extraordinarily strong strategic incentive to only have two major competitive parties. I know the idea of third parties is very popular. The political science research would throw some cold, maybe some lukewarm water on that. Be careful what you wish for, because in a lot of other countries, when they have more than two parties, they tend to be extremist parties that maybe offer some opportunities for greater representation, but can sometimes represent a pretty ugly side of our society too.
Ben Singer, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. I will add, though, that we don't necessarily have a partisan plurality first past the post system in every election in the United States. In those systems, that's where you're going to devolve into a two-party system because of the rules. But in places where you have multi-member districts like Illinois used to have, or proportional representation, or approval voting, these are areas where you can get third parties, or fusion voting, even like New York City has had, or New York State. So there are systems in the US where third parties have some viability or some role to play. But if folks really want third parties, it's pretty much a waste of time and money to try to make your third party viable before you focus on changing the system first. I also want to mention on the voter fraud bit, something maybe a little unpopular, having seen how democratic the crowd who's here watching skews. But the idea that voter fraud or election fraud is not something we should ever be concerned about, I think would be a huge mistake. Election fraud is something that absolutely has happened in the US in the past. And there's nothing wrong with being vigilant and making sure we have strong rules in place to prevent it from happening again. That's something we should all be able to get behind.
Yeah, I think that it was from the Pendergast era in Kansas City, where American Public Square is located, where the famous thought that just because you died didn't mean you gave up your right to vote was coined. Tricia, do you have Tricia, do you have another question for us?
I do. I have a follow-up, kind of related to the lengthy answer that Mr. Ginsberg gave to the last question about third parties. People are wondering, is there a potential for policy actions that might actually have a best chance at expanding opportunities? If we talked about open primaries, ranked choice voting, or nonpartisan elections at the local level, do you think that any of these actions could potentially have an impact?
Well,
I think,
go ahead, Ben.
well, I mean, my action can be equally short to that. I mean, the issue is I don't think that's ever going to come to pass. And I think by and large, those notions well up when your team is losing elections that you want to be winning. And so there is a great desire to change the rules of the game. And then all sorts of interesting policy arguments develop from that. But it's still changing the rules of the game because you don't like the results, that your ideas are not winning enough votes. So it can't be that my ideas are wrong. We need to change the rules under which we're playing. It is roughly the equivalent, since you're a Kansas City-based group, of trying to change football games so that the winner is determined on who got the most yards, as opposed to the most points. Don't worry, you got 130 yards more than the Bills did on Sunday. But if the rule of the game was changed to scoring in the red zone, because the red zone really tells the great teams from the bad teams, I don't know, the Bills were 3 for 3, and I think the Chiefs were 3 for 5. So I don't know.
Okay, Ben Singer, I know you've got a thought or two on this topic, so why don't you jump in here and sort of talk about the question, respond to the question, and to what Ben Ginsburg had to say.
Sure. Yeah, this is maybe the first time I'm going to disagree with what Ben has to say. We actually experienced this in St. Louis, where I am, where we had partisan plurality system where it was all about who won the Democratic primary. But of course, under a plurality system, that means if you have 5 or 7 candidates running, you can win with 30-something% of the vote, which is what happened many times in citywide and local races. So we were able to fix a lot of problems at the same time, something that could help third parties, but also ensures that whoever wins has a mandate to govern. And there were reporters, on the radio saying, "Man, couldn't St. Louis just move to a nonpartisan runoff type system like other cities?" And one person said the same thing that Ben just said, which is, that's never going to happen, because they don't think that politicians are going to make the change. But where we have ballot initiatives, we absolutely can make that change. And we put in place a system that St. Louis is the first of its kind. It's something that political scientists point to as a model system. And we were able to make it happen with a fully nonpartisan primary. You could vote for as many people as you want, which is called approval voting. And then top 2 went to a runoff, where you could, in that case, essentially rank your favorite candidate from the 2 most popular candidates, sort of combining the best of both approval voting and ranked choice voting into one system. And in this kind of system, a third party, let's say there was a Green or Libertarian or Constitution or Working Families Party that really wanted to organize and mobilize behind its platform and hold candidates accountable to adopt their platform and support them at the polls. That's a system in which that kind of third party or outside organized, grassroots movement could make a big difference. And that was what we designed the system to do, was to empower citizens, voters, community organizations to be able to advance an agenda that comes from the people, rather than just defaulting to who has a D next to their name or the most name recognition or things like that. It forces candidates to campaign on issues. And those are the kind of things where third parties can sometimes be successful. It's certainly not the only system in which that happens. I mentioned New York's fusion voting. Proportional representation is something that's starting to catch more steam in the United States in some local elections. And every socio-political movement in American history, whether you're talking about suffrage for women, civil rights, things related to prohibition of alcohol or marijuana, these things start at city and state levels. And then once you get to 5, then 30 states, that's when you see Congress or the Supreme Court step in and make a decision. So it absolutely is possible. But if you're talking about federal change, that's a long game. That's generational.
Okay.
Ben
So
Singer, let me ask a factual question just to bring this out. And I don't know the answer to it. What's the Republican base vote within St. Louis?
The city of St. Louis, relatively very small, probably about 20%.
Right, it's probably even less than that, but those are the sorts of areas where you can actually get these reforms passed. Much more difficult in states that are kind of similar in political strength, with the possible exception of ranked choice voting in Maine and Alaska. Although I'd kind of argue Alaska is pretty one party too.
Okay, so Greg Vanami, you and I have talked a little about this in the past. So essentially, if the system is semi-rigged by the 2 parties, in other words, when I say rigged, I mean that they essentially have no incentive whatsoever to move away from this, why isn't this a good way to kind of pry that whole thing open and sort of change the way the way candidates have to run, and then in the end, maybe we have a little more confidence in who we elect?
So Alan, I take it by the nature of your question, you're thinking about the ranked choice voting. Is that?
Yeah.
And I think Trish, originally.
Open primaries, take your pick,
Yeah, so I think there were a couple of things. I think there were open primaries, ranked choice voting. I don't know if there was another one. So I mean, they're all treated as sort of this basket of reforms, but they all sort of do or don't do slightly different things. So open primaries, the research shows, generally doesn't make that much difference for who gets elected. There's this narrative that open primaries leads to more centrist candidates. The actual research, if you look at a bunch of elections, it doesn't really affect the ideological composition of your politics or your legislature. So you can do it, participation goes up, but in terms of your actual output, if you're worried about polarization and your only answer is open primaries, we're going to be disappointed in the outcome. Like, so we're not going to close up American public square because we get open primaries. We don't have to worry about civility anymore. I mean, it's just not going to get us that far, very far at all. Ranked choice voting is a very different system of voting, and it hasn't been used in a lot of places. We don't have the same track record of evidence for what the actual impact of ranked choice voting is. The early results suggest it doesn't make that much difference. So some of the other things that Benjamin was talking about with multi-member districts with proportional representation, I mean, if you really want to open the door to things where you can get a 10, 15, 20% party, one that's pretty small, actually getting meaningful representation, multi-member districts and proportional representation is the way to go. Something like ranked choice voting might introduce an opportunity to have a third party voice on a platform. It might be a way to run a local election, but I mean, is this going to be the path forward to really break apart the two-party system? That's unlikely, because as long as we have, I mean, you can just think it, as long as we have single member districts, as long as at the end of the day, we're electing one person and only one person, that person is going to need a whole heck of a lot of votes from somewhere. And that's going to tend to devolve into one of two major parties, because I mean, you're just going to need huge, stable coalitions just to be competitive, no matter how you aggregate the votes.
Okay, let me just sort of, I want to go back for just a second to the idea of what we might be able to do to kind of break this sort of, this conversation between Democrats and Republicans that doesn't seem to lead anywhere. I read an article the other day about, evidently there's a county in the northern part of Georgia that is going from 7 polling places to 1 polling place. But where they're putting the 1 polling place is in the African American precinct in that county. And the rationale for going from 7 to 1 was the supervisor of elections said, we don't have enough people to move the machines around in the different parts. In other words, but the reaction from the African American community, at least those who spoke to the New York Times, was, well, we think there's something nefarious about this. And to some degree, it's how we have this history. We have this sort of like, is there a way to break this cycle? Is there something we can do to suddenly sort of make everyone sort of say, okay, we're going to try and do something a little different? I mean, Ben Ginsberg, you've been around the Republican Party a long time. You understand the psyche of your party and basically the politics of it. I realize it's a little different today than it was when you started out in it, but nonetheless, is there something that could suddenly make people sort of say, oh, okay.
Well, I mean, I think there is, and I remain optimistic about that. I think it is not at all a national solution. I think that we tend to frame this issue in largely national terms. And I think it's actually a very community-based answer. I think that there are any number of programs that we've all been reading about lately, where if you have polar opposites in the same room talking to each other in small groups, you get a really different reaction from the way our political debate sounds. And so I think the answer is actually a sustained community organizing effort. I'm talking through one where, in order to try and increase faith in election results, we would actually hold meetings in very local communities with leaders across the spectrum, from business and education and the religious community and the election officials, to have the election officials explain why elections are credible and to hear the concerns from really both sides of the political spectrum, but they got to be in the same room talking to each other. And that's what we've really gotten away from in this country. It ain't legislation.
Right. Well, no, it's interesting. Of course, American Public Square, that what you just enunciated is the premise of this organization when we started it, with the idea being that people who didn't agree, sitting in the same room, had a tendency to recognize things about each other that they wouldn't have known otherwise.
Yeah.
So, so do you think that we can? Let me get Ben Singer in on this thing. So,
Yeah.
Where do you think we can go realistically? You agree with Ben Ginsburg? It's got to be done at the local level.
Obviously, that's always ideal. The question is just scalability. Who's going to do it? Who's going to fund it? Who's going to run it? I will say Kentucky provides a potential model for how we can forge bipartisan consensus where we can make it easy to vote and hard to cheat, and ensure that there's real and perceived election integrity across the political spectrum, where everyone feels, yeah, it's hard to cheat, and also, these elections are credible because anyone who wants to vote can vote. And in Kentucky, they passed laws that do that. And the truth is that laws that improve election security are often the same as laws that improve election access. And election integrity, of course, is the combination of both of those two things. For example, when it comes to vote by mail, Missouri does not have very good signature matching, curing, processes, training, staffing to do those things. It's inconsistent across the state in different counties. For a lot of county clerks, running elections is just one small part of their job. And so if we were able to improve things like that, that improves both election security and election access, making sure that people who are registered voters are having their votes count, and those who aren't, don't. So I do think bipartisan compromise is possible. The real challenge there is, do both parties have the leverage and power to make that happen? In Missouri, given some of the vacancies in the Missouri House, there could be some leverage that the Democratic, usually super minority, no longer super minority, could have to do that. The key in Kentucky was that there's a Democratic governor and there was a Republican legislature, and they were able to create a compromise that I don't think either side would have designed on its own, but they were able to do something that ultimately most people were able to agree on, and I think will make Kentucky's probably some of the most perceived legitimate elections in the country.
Okay, so Greg Vanami, tell me whether I'm worried about something I shouldn't worry about. We have these laws that have passed in different states. They create a process where the state legislature can impose its will over has more discretion in determining what electors are going to be sent to Washington to what electoral votes are going to be sent to Washington, and selecting the electors, which theoretically was passed under this notion, well, if they find all this fraud, they can overcome the fraud. One might argue that if you're in a blue state, you might find voter suppression so much that you can overcome the voter suppression by doing the same thing if the laws exist. Am I worried? Is this like something that is just more blue smoke and mirrors, or is it a real threat?
So kind of both. So on the thing, so state legislatures claiming this power to invalidate a presidential election to send their own slate of electors, I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep over that. I mean, at the end of the day, state legislatures are elected bodies. They're going to do what their electorate wants, and they're probably not going to screw around with that too much. So I mean, if they get a clear mandate from their voters, no matter what their partisan preferences are, they're still going to be responsive to those voters. I think it's not a high likelihood that they're going to want to sort of stick their thumb in the eye of the constituents that keep them in office. Now, it's the lower level things that I think are maybe more potentially troubling, and I think Ben has alluded to some of this. When we have state legislatures sort of claiming the authority to fire local election officials, or to reconstitute state election boards, or to take power away from professional election administrators. That's something that's potentially laying the groundwork for real serious election misconduct. I mean, infusing a level of partisanship in. We've always had a degree of partisanship in election administration, but it's been pretty muted. That's potentially opening the door to a significant infusion of partisanship into the election administration process. If we convene this panel a year from now, or 3 years from now after the next two elections? That's a conversation point where we might be saying, remember back in the good old days in 2021, when things weren't so bad. I mean, that's something where I think we could really have some unanticipated problems that I don't think people are paying enough attention to.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Tricia for some questions from our audience, but at some point I want to come back to that point that the question to get a response from our other panelists. Tricia, what you got for us?
People were already asking about concern from the panelists that the certification changes and processes that might be ongoing in states might impact upcoming elections. There's some question about, are there alternatives? Could the federal government step in? What is your suggestion, if any, on a resolution to quell that fear?
Okay, who wants to start off on that? Ben?
Well, I'm happy to. Let's separate out a couple of different issues here. First of all, the idea of state legislatures replacing election officials and certifying ballots is going to be really tough, except under some narrow circumstances. So I think Greg's right about that. Every state legislature has an obligation before the election to say what the process is in their state for determining the winning slate of electors. Every legislature in history has said that's the popular vote. I think a state legislature probably has the authority before the election to tell all its constituents, the heck with you, we're going to decide who won the election. But they have to stand for election too. So I think that's a pretty unlikely outcome. And while 7 states considered legislation to try and really determine the certification of elections, that didn't pass anywhere. Georgia and Arizona were the only states that actually passed something to restrain their secretaries of state from doing this. I mean, I think that what you have to watch out for is there are a number of officials a number of people running for office who have said they don't believe that the 2020 elections were valid, and they would refuse to certify the winner of an election. It doesn't matter in a congressional context, because each house is the judge of its own members. So Congress is going to decide who the legitimately elected representative or senator is, and they can recount the vote on their own authority. When it comes to the Electoral College, the concern would be that an official like a Secretary of State or a governor who has certification powers would refuse to certify a slate of electors. And that raises a couple of things. Number one, maybe a legislature could step in at that point and say, our state's not going to be disenfranchised in the Electoral College, so we're going to do it. I think that runs into serious roadblocks. But if a state refuses to certify a slate of electors at all, and there's therefore no electors from that state, that could be outcome determinant, right? Imagine a state in a really tight election not certifying electors, so no candidate gets the required 270 electoral votes, which then flips the election to the House of Representatives. So that would be the scenario. The cure for that is something I think we're going to talk about later, which is amendments to the Electoral Count Act that are now undergoing a surprising and pretty robust brisk of activity.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to that in a second. But Ben Singer, you want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I had a really interesting conversation about this recently with Kevin Johnson at the Election Reformers Network, which has put in a significant amount of time studying this issue. And they recently released a report about the Canadian system of having the highest level of election administration officials be nonpartisan professionals. And of course, in the US, we don't have any such expectation. A lot of the people who have ultimate authority over some of our elections are partisan secretaries of state or partisan, county clerks or election administrators. Many of the election administrators do a fantastic job. The professionals who those powers are really delegated to. the legislatures, partisan politicians in legislatures or governors, trying to take away some of these independent or professional election administrators' responsibilities is a huge threat to our democracy and the perceived legitimacy of our democracy. And if you can judge the quality of a democracy by its perceived legitimacy and trust among the people, Canada is doing a much better job. And, Canada isn't some, far left, liberal utopia or something. It's had very competitive elections. It's had conservative leadership at the national level. But if you look at the data, and I just pulled it up now, in Canada in 2020, they percent of voters expressing confidence in the honesty of their country's elections was close to 80%. In the US, it was looks like around 45%. So we really could follow a model where we should be giving more authority and more power to nonpartisan professionals to administer elections instead of taking it away. Unlike Greg, I'm a little bit more worried about this idea of legislatures having the ability to overturn election results, as a group that predominantly uses ballot initiatives to go around politicians because inherently there are broken incentives at play. It's hard for me to trust that they're going to follow the will of the people when we've seen at state and local levels politicians who seem to be willing to overturn popularly passed ballot initiatives.
Okay, Tricia, we have time for one more question from the audience. Do you have one for us?
I do. A question that you might have seen coming. What if we had a magic wand, Alan, and we could take the big money out of elections? What kind of impact do you think that would have? How possible do you think that is, that there could be movement in that direction? And why don't we vote on Saturdays?
Well, I can tell you why you don't vote on Saturdays, because you have, being Jewish, observant Jews would find this to be objectionable, but that's a whole other question in terms of the Saturdays. As far as the money in politics is concerned, I'd like, if I can get concise answers from our panelists, because I'm going to go into the Electoral Count Act for a minute before we get a little further down the road. So who wants to tackle money in politics first? Can we get it out? And if we could get it out, what difference would it make? Ben Ginsberg. Oh, Ben Singer. Go ahead, Ben.
Sure. So political campaigns cost money to run. Americans spend $6 billion on Halloween candy. Democracy costs money too. So it's not really just a question of getting the big money out. It's also a question of where's the money going to come from that inevitably is needed. Public financing of elections has been, successful at mitigating the influence of big money, even in the Citizens United era. New York City, which had some of the most legendary corruption in city politics, has a lot of that corruption has gone down significantly under its fair elections public financing model. Democracy vouchers are also a really exciting new innovation that gives more power to voters. It creates new incentives and a new system in which pretty much all winners of elections are running on public financing because it opens the door for them to get that money, and it gives that power to voters to say where that money should go. Okay,
Ben Ginsberg, what do you think?
I think you will always have money in elections as long as there is a living, breathing First Amendment and Constitution. And so I think that the cure of getting rid of big money is not going to happen and not worth it. I do think we have a completely upside down campaign finance system. Remember, this system of stopping large contributions is designed to get rid of big money. But there is such a thing as the First Amendment, so that the one thing that the left and the right, or Democrats and Republicans, can agree on is that the current system is upside down and not working. And so this concept that we have now needs restructuring, and you can much better moderate both the influence of special interests and the amount of time that elected officials have to spend raising money, both of which are bad, and the fact that the most polarized rhetoric we have is on raising small dollar contributions these days, that it's time for a real rethink about the way money does get involved in politics, which is still essential to give politicians a microphone so the voters know what their views are.
Right. Okay. Greg Vanami, if I don't throw you into this conversation, into the next question right now, and that has to do with the Electoral Count Act. Now, we all saw, speaking of obscure, arcane bits of our electoral process before January 6th or before the 2020 count, I would say the Electoral Count Act was right on up there somewhere. We all know it was enacted after the 1876 debacle between Tilden and Hayes, and so we have this law, which was there was an attempt to use it to, frankly, overturn the election, and in carrying out its purposes was the date of January 6th when we had the riot at the Capitol. I do, like Ben Ginsberg, I've noticed that there's some conversation about doing something about it, because I think everyone looks up and realizes that this is not a good thing. So my question is, and I'll start with you, Greg, do you think that this could be the basis or the framework by fixing this to sort of maybe fix a few other things while they were at it?
I hadn't considered that possibility. I don't know. I don't know what else would be sort of on the menu for Congress. It's so hard for Congress to get anything done, especially around elections. I don't know what else they might consider for reforms to the act. I think the big thing for potential changes to the Electoral College will be the role of the vice president, and probably severely limiting, and they can't exclude the vice president altogether, but I think they might evolve to a place where he's literally just opening the envelopes and handing them off to the Senate pro tem, and then that'll be it for the vice president. So just clarifying what his role is, his or her role is, and then minimizing that because they're often on the ballot.
Ben Singer, what do you think?
Speaking to the last thing Greg mentioned in terms of, the vice president being on the ballot, I don't think it would be unreasonable to put in place reforms based on whether folks have a direct conflict of interest in terms of having served, being on the ticket, for instance. That's another thing that the Election Reformers Network has proposed, for example, when it comes to secretaries of state who are running for statewide office and have some role over certifying their own state's elections while they're on the ballot. So conflict of interest reforms tend to be very popular. And I think Republicans and Democrats in Congress, especially in the US Senate, where they tend to be a bit more statesmen and stateswomen-like, would do well to buck their party leadership if necessary and form a bipartisan gang, as they like to call themselves, which I believe is happening, and forge some really narrowly tailored and very common sense reforms to ensure that conflicts of interest are mitigated and that the process is credible. I think it would be a huge mistake to do anything that looks overtly partisan or like it's looking to game an upcoming election. So we would definitely encourage them to listen to their better angels.
Okay. I would just mention on the conflict of interest. In my lifetime, there have been 3 close elections where the vice president was either on the losing ticket or the losing candidate, and in all cases, they all acted quite appropriately. But Ben Ginsberg, go ahead and give us your take on this.
Sure, I'll give you 5 areas to look at in the Electoral Count Act, and then 5 possible provisions that might get added to it. I don't think conflict of interest is in there. There's a golden moment for the Electoral Count Act because I think everybody admits that it didn't work, and you can't game it right now because you will not know. None of these guys can figure out how to game it for their party because you don't know who the vice president is going to be. You don't know if your candidate is going to be ahead or behind with the election results, and you don't know which party will have the majority of the House of Representatives and the Senate at any point. So this is not subject to being gamed like all the other provisions that were in the bills were. So the vice president, reforming the role of the vice president, highly likely, ceremonial, what's called for in the Constitution, nothing more. They might well raise the threshold for objections. Right now, it just takes 1 House member and 1 senator to object to a slate. They might raise that to 20% of each chamber, a third, a half, who knows? They could limit Congress's ability to object to actual slates so that it would be the official in the state who certifies it. Congress can't become a national recount board and look at it. They might or might not put in a federal court remedy for a state official who doesn't properly do his or her job in the certification. Fourth, they might deal with what happens if a state fails to file a slate of electors, and they might well eliminate the safe harbor provision that says that a state can't be challenged if it gets its work done by a certain time. That's never been invoked, and it would be subject to challenge if it ever were. So there might be a new timeline for when the Electoral College meets. And fifth, they might clarify what happens in the case of a natural disaster or something like that. I mean, the Constitution says the election has to be on the same day, on one day. But what happens if there really is a Hurricane Sandy or a 9/11 that stops people from voting? And that's a huge gap right now. What they might add to the bill beyond the Electoral Count Act is provisions to protect election officials. You might have some standards for risk limiting audits afterwards to give people increased confidence that the elections were accurate. You might provide some funding for election administration that probably mistakenly was cut out of the infrastructure bill. And that might be combined with a ban on outside money, such as the Zuckerberg money that came in to run the elections. And you might require a paper trail for all ballots, so there are no just pure election machines where you can't really tell what happened. And they might do something to rejuvenate the election commission, which is in bad shape.
Right. Okay. Go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
In addition to
short comment, I have one more question from a student. Go ahead, Ben.
Sorry. In addition to raising the threshold for objections, Ben, I think, aren't they also talking about raising the number that would certify that to some supermajority of Congress?
Yeah, they're talking about it, but that's running into some headwinds. So I'm not sure where that's going.
Okay, so we have a question from a student. I said it was our last question, but we always encourage students to participate. So, Tricia, what's our student question for the panel?
Thank you, Alan. We've heard a lot of the folks that are joining us tonight have asked questions about the impact of the character and courage of political leaders on all of the issues that we have discussed tonight. But Avery asks directly, I'm a senior in high school and I am using this event as research for my capstone project. Here is the essential question for my project. How do we undo the dysfunctional political discourse we learn from powerful political leaders? Thank you.
Well, that's an easy one. Greg Vanami, you want to sort of weigh in on this?
Yeah, in terms of, I think our next questions are so what now what? Sort of thinking about that and thinking about, some of these things like what do we do, what do we change, what do we need to do? One of the barriers that we run up against is voter knowledge and information, citizen knowledge and information, which, we're preaching to the choir here. Most Americans are not spending their evening hours, listening to civic talk. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's our reality. It's like, I can tell you there's plenty of examples of this. Half of Americans don't know which party is the more pro-life party. We can't exaggerate how much people know, understand, and care about politics. So when it comes to something like forming an opinion about the integrity of elections, those post-audit and recount procedures are enormously complex and variable. It's far beyond the capacity of an average voter to evaluate whether or not, is that a reasonable process? Was the election fair or not? They are reliant. So these are sort of the two entities that we haven't talked a lot about: losing candidates and the media. I mean, they said they are so important for signaling to voters whether or not the election went off right. Should I trust it as a voter? The losing candidate trusted. They said it's okay. Must be okay. They have an incentive not to do that. And the media, we've got so many problems with trust in the media right now that continues to erode, that it's, as long as we have candidates who are going to do things like the student asked about, who are going to lodge spurious challenges against elections, it's going to be really, really hard and maybe impossible to undo that kind of damage if that's something if that's sustained, if that's our long-term future.
Okay, what I'm going to do now is we're going to move to what we normally do when we conclude our programs, and feel free to address that issue in this. And we sort of initiated this a number of years ago. It was like, so what? And now what? The so what basically being, so what have we really learned? What sort of like do we think is the most important thing to come out of this conversation? And then the now what is, what do you as an individual, what would you like people, what is you as an advocate, what would you like to see happen? I'd like to start this with Ben Singer.
Sure. Are we wrapping this section of the program or wrapping the entire program?
We're wrapping the program.
Okay. So the thing that we can do, as Greg was saying, we're preaching to the choir. This is a small group of people whose political knowledge is much higher. But what we can do as advocates is we can change the broken incentives in the system. The incentives, unfortunately, are not necessarily for catering to public service, but catering to narrow political self-interests. So what we can do is we can change the structure of the systems to make it so that the incentives are to build consensus rather than divide us. Because as long as our political leaders have an incentive to cater to small political primaries for extreme primary voters, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, then they are going to advance that narrative, and the media likes sensationalism, and that's what they're going to carry. But there is an initiative petition in Missouri right now for it's called Better Elections, and you can look it up at betterelectionsmode.org. And it would improve the integrity of our elections, and it would also create open primaries with statewide ranked choice voting for state and federal elections. And, as Greg said, nothing is a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but it is going to create an incentive for politicians to not be as divisive and to cater more towards the center of the electorate. And because what we have right now is a vicious cycle where politicians cater to that extreme primary electorate, the media carry it, make that primary electorate more and more extreme, and it gets worse and worse. What we can do is we can stop that, and we can start a virtuous cycle where politicians have to cater more to the center and citizens will take their cue. So if we really want to change the culture, the quickest and easiest way to start that change is changing the incentives that are feeding into those problems and supporting reforms like better elections.
Okay. Ben Ginsberg. So what? What?
Well, thank you. Well, let me answer that by responding directly to the student's question, which I think was a great question and really kind of goes directly to what we're talking about. So I think Greg is right. These are big, complicated questions without any ready answers for this. And so what I do think is that all of this begins locally. So you're a student in school. These are big, complicated questions. There is a huge amount of lack of knowledge and misinformation and not understanding about our government and who our politicians are and how we should be studying them. Take a look at the civics program in your school and in your school system. It is really unfortunate, I think, that we've gotten away from this country in studying government and vesting students in understanding how the government is supposed to work, how to formulate ideas, how the clash of ideas is actually good and produces better ideas. It should not be going into your particular corners. So take a look at your school and the civics program for students of all ages. And then secondly, the answer of how you reverse the venom that's coming from politicians that you don't like is honestly, there is no silver bullet. What the answer is the much more direct requirement to get involved yourself in this. The way the system gets fixed is by
I think, Ben, we lost you there for a second. You're frozen on us.
I want to know how the system gets fixed.
getting
No,
involved, contributing to the dialogue, solve this. It comes
okay, you're
down
back.
to the people involved. I'm sorry, it comes down to the people involved in this. So
Okay.
be a person who's involved in it.
Okay, Greg Vanami.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, there's an old line about democracy that we get the government we deserve. So, I mean, as long as there's an appetite and a market for divisive, toxic politics, we're going to have leaders that deliver it to us. I mean, that's not an easy solution, but I mean, and you might say, well, it's unfair, it's unreasonable. We might expect a higher standard of behavior from our leaders than we expect from the public. But given where things are right now with our elections, I think that's unlikely to happen. Now, in terms of my bottom line, so what, now what? I think it was the second poll that Denisha put up. I wrote it down there. 26 people on this call said they planned to get involved in local elections or, in something with their election process. Please do that. We talk about elections as if they're this big national phenomenon. They're actually local. I mean, every election is actually about 7,500 little local elections that are primarily administered at the local level. These are people in your community. They are often under-resourced and stretched to the max trying to get this job done. They are often short on time. They are often short on staff. So if you are thinking about being a poll worker, an election judge, running for an election board, please do that. There's so much demand. And I don't know, I don't know if I can't speak for American Public Square, but I would think if we could come out of this hour-long meeting with 26 more poll workers somewhere out there in the world, at least from my perspective, this would be an hour very well spent. To do that, if you're in Kansas City is a little bit unusual. They have municipal elections, go to the Kansas City Election Board. If you're not in Kansas City, go to your county clerk and recorder. Those are mostly who administer elections in most places in the U.S.
Okay, well, a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to give a short answer to the question that we got. I've always assumed that those of us need to insist on better behavior from the people that we agree with politically, because it's very easy to criticize the people across on the other side. And frankly, when we do that in this day and age, it doesn't seem to have much impact. So I would encourage all of us to look to the people who are on our side and make sure that they're behaving well. I want to thank our panelists, Ben Ginsberg, Ben Singer, Greg Vanami, for this wonderful conversation. I want to thank our program committee, our roving reporter, Tricia Maxwell, who I called Teresa twice tonight, and I feel bad about. But Tricia, by the way, Ben is coordinating a civics program at our high schools and colleges here in the area. So we think it's important, and she's doing a wonderful job. Chris LeBeau, who's our fact checker, and the staff of American Public Square, several of whom you met tonight, for their contribution to the program, particularly Denisha Snell, our program director. Tomorrow, you're going to receive an email with a short post-event survey. Please take a moment to complete the survey. It helps us in terms of viewing our programs. It'll be very short, we promise you that. We do rely on the support of our members in order to continue to provide programs. So if you're not a member, please become one. And if you are already a member, bring someone else in so that they can become a member, so that we can continue to offer the programs that we do. You can find membership information on our website at americanpublicsquare.org. I want to thank you for being here tonight. We hope you're going to join us again, and have a safe and a very healthy week. Good night, everyone.